Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we tackle the big questions about what makes us tick. Today, we're going straight to the heart of it, language.
hmm
Ever stop to think about how we went from maybe some basic animal noises to having full-blown conversations, telling stories, even writing poetry?
Right.
That's what we're unpacking today.
It's a journey that's as fundamental as walking upright, really, and figuring out how language evolved is
Well, it's like being a detective, trying to solve a case where the main piece of evidence, language itself, in its earliest forms, has vanished without a trace.
completely gone.
Yeah. So we have to rely on all sorts of indirect clues to reconstruct the story.
Exactly.
Mm.
Imagine trying to figure out how a complex machine works when all you have are a few scattered gears, maybe some faded blueprints, and perhaps a similar machine from a slightly different era.
That's a good analogy.
To even begin to understand the origins of language, we need a whole team of experts looking at different angles. We're talking about people who study ancient bones,
hmm
paleoanthropologists.
Those who dig up old tools and settlements, that's archaeologists.
Right.
Scientists who observe how our primate cousins communicate, comparative primatologists.
Crucial.
Geneticists tracing the evolution of key genes, neuroscientists mapping the language centers in our brains, and of course, linguists who study the structure of language itself.
It's a real intellectual Avengers assembling for this one, as you say.
Definitely.
And what's fascinating is how each field provides a unique window into this evolutionary process. Paleoanthropology can reveal changes in our physical structure, like, brain size and the shape of the vocal tract.
Physical hardware.
Exactly. Archaeology gives us tangible evidence of cognitive complexity through the artifacts our ancestors created. Studying living primates, that gives us a crucial baseline understanding of communication abilities that might predate language.
Okay.
Genetics can help pinpoint the genes that might have played a role. Neuroscience shows us the brain regions involved in language today, giving us clues about their potential evolution.
And linguistics.
Yeah.
How does that fit in when the old languages are gone?
Well, linguistics, while it can't directly study languages that existed hundreds of thousands of years ago, helps us understand the fundamental properties of language itself. What makes language language?
Got it. So our mission for this deep dive, and you're already strapped in with us, is to explore how our ancestors managed to communicate before they had anything we'd really recognize as complex language.
Mm-hmm.
We'll be looking at the biological changes that made language possible in the first place, and we'll dive into some of the leading ideas about how and why this incredible ability came to be.
Yeah, ultimately, we're trying to understand a core part of what makes us human, that ability to share our thoughts and ideas in such intricate ways.
Right.
And before we get too far, it's probably important to clarify some terms that often come up. You'll hear hominid,
Okay.
which at one time was used more specifically for humans and their close ancestors. But in current scientific understanding, hominid is actually a broader term. It includes all the great apes.
All of them. So chimps, gorillas.
That's us, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans, along with all our extinct ancestors. Think of it as the whole extended family of great apes.
Okay, so if hominid is the entire great ape clan, what's the term for our specific branch of the family tree? The one that leads directly to us after we split off.
That's where hominin comes in. Hominin. This is the more precise term. It refers to modern humans, all extinct human species, and all of our immediate ancestors after our evolutionary split from the chimpanzee and bonobo lineages.
Right.
So while chimps and bonobos are very close cousins within the hominid family, when we're focusing on the evolution of human communication specifically, we'll be talking about hominins.
Got it. Hominid. Big family gathering with all the apes. Hominin. Our direct line after we branched off from the chimps and bonobos, and that split was, what, around 6 to 8 million years ago?
Exactly, somewhere in that range. And it's vital to remember that this hominin lineage started in Africa, and the vast, vast majority of our evolutionary story unfolded there. Now, let's focus on some of the key hominin actors in this story and what we can infer about their communication abilities. We'll start with Australopithecus.
Ah, Lucy's group.
That's the one. They lived roughly 4 to 2 million years ago, mainly in East and South Africa. And yes, Lucy is a famous example of Australopithecus afarensis.
A real rock star of paleoanthropology.
So, Australopithecus, what were they like and how did they likely communicate?
Well, key features include their early adoption of walking on two legs, bipedalism, though probably not exactly like we do today. still spend time in trees, likely.
Right.
Crucially, their brain size was very similar to modern great apes, around 400 to 500 cubic centimeters.
So pretty small compared to us.
Relatively, yes. And based on this, scientists generally believe their communication would have been much like what we see in chimpanzees and bonobos today.
Which means?
Lots of gestures, facial expressions, and a limited range of vocalizations tied to specific emotions or situations, warnings, food, excitement, that sort of thing. So kind of like how my dog lets me know it wants to go out. Specific bark, maybe some tail wagging, nudging the door.
That's actually a pretty good everyday analogy for the level of complexity we're probably talking about. Basic needs, immediate situations.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah.
So moving forward in time.
Let's move on to Homo habilis, who appeared around 2.4 to maybe 1.4 million years ago, also in East Africa. This hominin is particularly interesting because they were long associated with the oldest known deliberately made stone tools.
The old on tools, right? The handyman.
Exactly, Homo habilis, the handyman. Besides tool use, what else distinguished them from Australopithecus, especially when we think about communication?
Yeah, worthy upgrades.
Well, Homo habilis had a slightly larger brain, maybe 600 to 650 cc on average. Still small, but a noticeable jump. They also had smaller teeth and a flatter face than Australopithecines. And some fossil hand bones suggest their hands were becoming more adapted for precise manipulation, which, would have been helpful for making tools.
Okay, and communication-wise?
The general idea is that they likely use more complex gestures and perhaps a slightly wider variety of basic vocalizations, maybe to better coordinate during activities like scavenging, which was probably important.
A bit more teamwork needed?
Potentially. And there's also been some debate, this is interesting, based on studying the insides of their skulls, these endocasts,
Right.
about a possible early development in the brain region corresponding to Broca's area in modern humans.
Broca's area. That's key for speech production, isn't it?
It is crucial. So seeing potential changes there early on is intriguing. A possible early sign of the brain evolving for something beyond just basic calls.
Wow.
But, and this is important, that interpretation is still debated. It's hard to tell for sure from just the shape of the inside of a skull.
Right, gotta be cautious.
And another crucial point, the very oldest stone tools we found now actually seem to predate the emergence of Homo habilis.
Really? Older than handyman.
Yeah, maybe by hundreds of thousands of years. This suggests that tool use itself might have originated even earlier in our lineage, maybe with late Australopithecus or some other early hominin we haven't pinned down yet.
Okay, so that complicates the picture.
It does. It makes a direct link between Homo habilis specifically, tool making, and a big jump in communication less straightforward than we once thought. Making tools likely required some cognitive advances, sure, but maybe not necessarily a huge leap in communication right then and there.
Right, so maybe tool use started earlier and the communication side developed more gradually. Okay, who's next on the timeline?
Next up, we have Homo erectus, and these guys were around for a very long time, from about 1.9 million years ago, maybe even as recently as 100,000 years ago in some places, a real evolutionary long-distance runner.
Incredible staying power.
Absolutely. Homo erectus was remarkably successful and adaptable. They had significantly larger brains, ranging from about 750 cc up to over 1200 cc in later individuals.
Getting closer to our range?
Definitely entering the lower end of the modern human range. They also had a more modern body shape, very well suited for walking long distances, possibly even running.
And they were the first to leave Africa, right?
That's perhaps their most significant achievement, yes. The first homin known to have migrated out of Africa, spreading across Asia and even into parts of Europe.
Wow. The first global travelers in our family.
Yeah.
Now, that kind of migration. Plus, they had more sophisticated tools, right? The Acheulean ones?
Yes, the Acheulean toolkit with those distinctive teardrop-shaped hand axes, more standardized, more complex to make than Oldowan tools.
Okay, so bigger brains, better tools, migrating across continents, evidence suggesting they controlled fire, maybe had planned campsites, maybe even cared for the sick members of their group.
All of that. Yeah.
That all just screams for a more advanced way to communicate than just basic gestures and simple sounds. It's like trying to coordinate a multi-day camping trip with a bunch of friends. You need more than just pointing and grunting to figure out who's bringing the tent, who's cooking, what happens if someone gets hurt.
Precisely. That's a perfect analogy. The complexity of these behaviors, the planning, the coordination, the social cohesion needed for migration and group living strongly suggests a need for more advanced communication, something beyond what we see in apes or even Homo habilis.
So what do we think they had? Not full language yet, maybe?
Many researchers believe Homo erectus possessed a form of proto-language.
Proto-language. What does that mean exactly?
Think of it as a communication system that was more complex than ape calls and gestures, but likely lacked the full grammatical structure and maybe the huge vocabulary of modern human language. It probably involved a combination of gestures and increasingly complex learned vocalizations.
So more words, maybe simple combinations.
Possibly. Maybe even the very beginnings of symbolic communication were present, though that's debated. Anatomically, their vocal tract was likely still intermediate between apes and modern humans.
But maybe not the full range of sounds we can make?
Probably not. But their brains were definitely evolving in ways that would support more complex thought and communication. The demands of their lifestyle planning hunts, making sophisticated tools, maintaining social bonds across wider areas, coordinated migrations, likely drove this development.
So if Australopithecus was like your dog asking to go outside, and Homo habilis was maybe a slightly more insistent cat wanting food, Homo erectus is like that group of friends trying to plan that complicated camping trip. They need more than simple signals to get everyone on the same page.
That's a fantastic way to put it. Captures the increasing complexity.
Okay. After the long reign of Homo erectus, who comes next?
Then we have Homo heidelbergensis, who lived roughly 700,000 down to about 200,000 years ago, found in Africa, Europe, and possibly Asia.
And they're important because
They're often considered a direct ancestor of both Neanderthals in Europe and Asia and Homo sapiens in Africa. Kind of a pivotal species at a fork in the road.
the common ancestor, potentially. What communication advancements do we think arose with Homo heidelbergensis?
Well, they had large brains, averaging around 1,200 to 1,300 cc, squarely in the modern human range. They had a strong, robust build, and technologically they developed more advanced tools, including evidence for hafted spears putting stone points on wooden shafts.
That required some serious planning and skill.
Absolutely. Suggests sophisticated hunting strategies. Given their brain size, their technology, and their position in our family tree, leading to two lineages known for complex cognition and communication, many scientists believe that significant steps towards the full capabilities of modern language likely occurred during the time of Homo heidelbergensis.
Laying more groundwork.
Exactly. The foundations for more intricate communication were likely being solidified.
Okay, which leads us to one of those descendants, the Neanderthals.
Yeah.
Homo neanderthalensis, everyone's heard of them. Europe and Western Asia, cold adapted.
Right. They lived from about 400,000 years ago down to maybe 40,000 years ago. And Neanderthals are particularly fascinating when we talk about the origins of language.
Why is that? Because they used to be portrayed as brutish cavemen.
Precisely. That view has changed dramatically. They had large brains, on average, actually slightly larger than our own today, around 1,500 cc, though brain organization might matter more than size alone.
Still, big brains.
Definitely. And they were incredibly capable. They crafted sophisticated Mosserian tools, clearly controlled fire. They systematically buried their dead sometimes even with grave goods, suggesting symbolic thought.
Burials imply thinking about death, maybe belief systems.
It certainly suggests something more complex than just disposing of a body. They also created personal ornaments, like pendants or using pigments. These behaviors strongly point towards complex thinking and the ability to use symbols.
So cognitively, they seem pretty advanced. What about actual speech? Could they talk like us?
This is where the evidence gets really compelling. Anatomically, a small U-shaped bone in the neck called the hyoid bone.
The hyoid. What does that do?
It sits at the base of the tongue and supports the larynx. It doesn't articulate with any other bone, but it's crucial anchor point for muscles involved in tongue movement and swallowing and speech. And the Neanderthal hyoid bones we found, like the famous one from Kabara Cave in Israel, are virtually identical to ours.
Really? Identical?
Pretty much indistinguishable. This suggests they had the physical anatomy in the throat region necessary to produce a wide range of sounds, similar to us.
Okay, that's big. What else?
Genetically, we now know they possess the same key variants of the FOXP2 gene that we do.
Ah, FOXP2 again.
Yeah.
The one linked to speech disorders.
Exactly. That crucial gene involved in speech motor control and language learning. Finding the modern human version in Neanderthals was a major discovery.
So the anatomy looks right, a key gene looks right.
Exactly. Add that to the archaeological evidence for symbolic behavior. The current scientific understanding strongly suggests that Neanderthals were capable of speech production and complex communication. Potentially even language with a level of sophistication similar to that of early Homo sapiens.
Wow. So definitely not just basic grunts then. It sounds like Neanderthals were much more linguistically advanced than the old stereotypes allowed.
Absolutely. The pendulum has swung quite far on that.
Okay, finally, we arrive at our own species, Homo sapiens, originating in Africa.
Hmm.
When did we first show up?
The earliest fossils recognized as Homo sapiens date back to around 300,000 years ago, found in Morocco.
300,000 years, wow. And then eventually spreading across the entire globe.
That's the story. We're characterized by a large brain, averaging around 1300 cc, a high, rounded skull, a flatter face with a prominent chin, and a more slender, graceful skeleton compared to earlier hominins like Neanderthals.
And technologically and behaviorally.
Early Homo sapiens in Africa are associated with the Middle Stone Age tool industries, which show significant innovation. And crucially, we see the clear emergence of symbolic behavior, things like the use of ochre pigments, maybe for body painting or art, engraved objects, shell beads used as ornaments, starting perhaps around 100,000 years ago or even earlier.
The unmistakable signs of complex thought and culture.
Exactly. And of course, as the only surviving hominin species, we possess the full capacity for modern language in all its diversity and complexity and the complex culture that goes with it.
Right, so we're the current champions of communication, standing on the shoulders of, well, a lot of evolutionary history.
A very long history, yes.
Okay, now that we've met some of the key players in our evolutionary story, let's take a step back. We've talked about the kind of communication these hominins might have had. But what were the fundamental building blocks before language as we know it even existed? What was communication like at a more basic, maybe pre-linguistic level?
That's a really crucial question. To understand what came before language, it's incredibly helpful to look at our closest living relatives, the other primates, especially chimpanzees and bonobos.
What can they tell us?
Well, when we compare how they vocalize versus how they use gestures, we see some really interesting and potentially significant differences.
Okay.
Primate vocalizations, things like alarm calls, food calls, contact calls, they tend to be pretty fixed. They seem to be largely innate, inborn responses.
Like a pre-programmed sound for danger.
Kind of, yeah. And they're often strongly tied to the animal's immediate emotional state, fear, excitement, distress. Also, the number of distinct calls in their repertoire is usually quite limited, especially compared to the vast vocabulary of human languages.
Makes sense.
And importantly, from a brain perspective, these vocalizations don't seem to be under the same kind of fine-grained voluntary control as human speech. They're often controlled by older, subcortical parts of the brain related to emotion. Think of it like having a small set of preset audio responses to certain situations.
Okay, limited and tied to emotions.
Yeah.
Not very flexible.
Not very flexible, exactly. Now compare that with primate gestures, especially hand and arm gestures.
How are they different?
They show a lot more flexibility. Apes can learn new gestures. They can even invent their own sometimes. They use them intentionally, often directed at specific individuals, and they'll adjust their gesturing based on whether the other individual is paying attention or how they respond.
So more adaptable and responsive.
Much more. It seems like gestures are under more voluntary control, linked to higher cortical areas of the brain. So instead of those preset vocal responses, you have actions that are more adaptable, more context-dependent, more thought out, you could say.
So it sounds like gestures might have offered a much better starting point, a more promising pathway for developing complex symbolic communication.
That's the core idea behind the gesture-first hypothesis.
Okay, tell me more about that.
This influential idea suggests that the existing capacity of primates for flexible, intentional, cortically controlled manual actions provided a better foundation, a sort of evolutionary launchpad for the development of symbolic communication than their more rigid, emotionally driven vocal systems did.
And walking upright helped.
Absolutely. The argument goes that as early hominins became bipedal, it freed up their hands from locomotion duties, allowing them to be used much more extensively for carrying things, making tools, and crucially, for gesturing.
So the idea is that early hominin communication likely relied heavily on a growing repertoire of hand and body gestures. Maybe even acting things out.
That's the picture, yes. Maybe involving a lot of pantomime initially. Our ancestors playing an elaborate, evolving game of charades to share information.
That's a compelling image. But is that the whole story? Was it just gestures?
Probably not. While the gesture-first idea is powerful, many researchers today favor what are called multimodal models.
Multimodal, meaning...
He's using multiple modes, multiple channels at once. These models suggest that gestures and vocalizations likely evolved together and were integrated from a very early stage.
Kind of like how we talk today.
Exactly. Think about how you communicate. You talk, you also use your hands, your facial expressions, your posture. It all works together to convey meaning.
Right, I definitely talk with my hands.
Most people do. It's quite likely that this combination of different ways of communicating has very deep roots in our evolution. So, while gesture might have played a really important early role, perhaps providing the initial scaffolding for symbolic reference, vocalizations were also likely part of the communication toolkit from relatively early on.
So it's not an either situation, but more of a both-and scenario. Maybe the balance shifted over time.
That's a very plausible view. Maybe gesture was dominant early on, but as vocal control improved, the vocal channel became increasingly important, perhaps because it frees the hands for other tasks or works better over distances or in the dark.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. A combination, evolving together. Now let's revisit those archaeological and fossil clues we talked about earlier, but specifically looking at what they might tell us about communication before anything we call full language. Starting with Australopithecus again.
Right. As we discussed, with brain sizes similar to apes and no clear evidence yet of sophisticated toolmaking requiring complex instruction, their communication was likely quite similar to modern apes.
Gestures, facial expressions, basic calls.
Pretty much. The kinds of signals you might see within a troop of baboons or chimpanzees for coordinating basic social interactions, warnings, finding food.
Okay. Then we have Homo habilis and those old one tools. Even if they weren't the very first tool makers, those tools are associated with them. What do these relatively simple chipstones tell us about communication needs?
Well, even making simple Oldowan tools consistently requires some level of learning, planning, and skilled hand-eye coordination. It suggests some cognitive advance over Australopithecus.
Right.
And that debated evidence for early changes in the Broca's area homologue, if correct, could hint at initial neurological shifts related to controlling communication, perhaps linking hand actions and vocalizations more effectively.
So maybe a slightly more complex system was emerging.
Possibly. Communication likely remained primarily gestural, but we might have started to see more structured or conventionalized vocal signals being used, perhaps for coordinating simple tasks like group scavenging, or maybe even some very basic form of instruction for tool making, though that's speculative.
Yeah, but the big question is whether making those tools required actual teaching something beyond just watching and imitating.
Exactly. If explicit teaching was necessary, that would imply a more sophisticated communication system than simple imitation allows. But given that the earliest tool use might predate H. habilis and the tools are relatively simple compared to later ones, it's not clear if that level of communication was strictly required yet.
So maybe it's a slight increase in complexity compared to Australopithecus, but still a long way from planning that camping trip.
Precisely. Now, Homo erectus, with their more complex Acheulean tools, their migrations across continents, controlling fire, this feels like a significant jump in the demands placed on communication, doesn't it?
It really does. Making those hand axes, the ones that look pretty similar across vast distances and times, that suggests some kind of shared template, maybe shared instruction.
That's one interpretation, yes. The standardization of Acheulean tools is intriguing. It suggests better planning, more foresight, and potentially the transmission of more complex knowledge or technique from one individual or generation to another.
And the migration, the fire, the social care.
All of it points to more sophisticated social organization and cooperation, successfully migrating out of Africa into new, unfamiliar environments, coordinating the use of fire, perhaps organizing hunts for larger game, maintaining social bonds in potentially larger or more dispersed groups, caring for injured or sick individuals.
That last one, caring for the sick, that implies empathy, but also maybe the ability to communicate needs or coordinate care.
It certainly suggests complex social bonds and perhaps more complex communication to manage those relationships and activities. These kinds of behaviors would have put considerable pressure on their communication systems to become more effective, more precise.
Which brings us back to proto-language.
Exactly. This is why many researchers are comfortable suggesting Homo erectus possessed some form of proto-language, a system more intricate than ape communication, likely combining gesture and increasingly complex, learned vocalizations, but probably still lacking the full grammatical complexity of modern language.
Could there have been symbols involved even then? Like maybe the hand axe itself had some meaning beyond just being a tool?
That's a fascinating, though highly debated, idea. Some researchers have speculated that the consistent, often symmetrical, and sometimes overly large or finely crafted nature of some Acheulean hand axes might hint at early symbolic or aesthetic functions, perhaps related to social status or even mating displays, but it's very hard to prove.
Still, it opens up the possibility. The significant increase in brain size in Homo erectus, along with suggestive changes in brain areas potentially related to language, also supports the idea of enhanced cognitive and communicative abilities. It's like their more complex way of life demanded and perhaps drove the evolution of a more complex way to share information, coordinate actions, and maintain those vital social bonds.
Well put. The demands and the capabilities likely pushed each other forward.
Okay, so we've seen how behavior and communication might have co-evolved. Let's switch gears now and talk about the actual biological machinery. What key anatomical adaptations do we see in the hominin lineage that specifically paved the way for spoken language?
One of the most critical developments involves the anatomy of the vocal tract, specifically the human supralaryngeal vocal tract, which is the part above the larynx or voice box.
Okay, what's special about ours?
Compared to other primates like chimpanzees, the human larynx is positioned much lower in the neck in adults.
Lower down. Why does that matter?
Well, that lower position, combined with changes in the shape and flexibility of the tongue, particularly the tongue root and the pharynx, creates a unique two-tube configuration. You essentially get a horizontal tube, the oral cavity, your mouth, and a roughly equal-length vertical tube, the pharynx, the part of your throat behind the mouth.
Okay, I can picture that, like an L shape almost.
Kind of, yeah. This specific shape is crucial. It allows the human tongue, which is incredibly muscular and agile, to make constrictions at various points along both the horizontal and vertical tubes. And doing that changes the resonant frequencies of the vocal tract.
Resonant frequencies,
Yeah.
like when you blow across a bottle top.
Exactly like that. These resonances are called formants, and by changing the shape of the vocal tract with our tongue, lips, etc., we can manipulate these formant frequencies. This ability is what allows us to produce the wide range of distinct vowel sounds like the point vowels I, E, and A, and U,
And those distinct vowels are important.
absolutely fundamental for spoken language. They form the basis of syllables and allow us to create a vast number of distinguishable words. Non-human primates, with their higher larynx and different vocal tract shape, simply can't produce the same range of vowel sounds.
But didn't this lower larynx come with a downside?
A significant one, yes.
Yeah.
Because the larynx is lower, the entrance to the airway, the larynx, and the entrance to the digestive tract, the esophagus, are both in the pharynx. This means the pathways for air and food cross.
Which increases our risk of choking.
Exactly. Food can accidentally go down the wrong pipe into the airway instead of the esophagus. Other mammals don't really have this problem to the same extent.
So the fact that we evolved this risky anatomy.
Strongly suggests that the advantages it conferred for speech must have been incredibly powerful from an evolutionary perspective. The benefits for communication must have outweighed the significant survival risk of choking.
That's a fascinating trade-off. It really highlights how important speech must have become. Now, what about our extinct relatives? Can we tell if they had the same low larynx and two-tube vocal tract?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's tricky because soft tissue like the vocal tract doesn't fossilize.
Right. So what clues do we use?
We have to rely on indirect evidence, primarily from the skeleton. One key indicator is the degree of flexion or bending at the base of the skull, the basicranium. In modern humans, the base of the skull is more flexed, which is thought to be related to accommodating that lower larynx and reorganizing the throat space.
So can we see this flexion in fossils?
We can measure it. Early interpretations, based on the skull base of some Neanderthal fossils, suggested they had a flatter skull base, more like apes, and therefore might not have had a fully modern vocal tract. This led to the idea they couldn't produce the full range of human speech sounds.
The old grunting Neanderthal idea again.
Exactly. But more recent analyses, using different methods and considering more fossil evidence, have challenged this. And remember that hyoid bone we talked about?
The Neanderthal hyoid from Kabara Cave.
Yes. Finding a hyoid bone that's essentially modern human-like in a Neanderthal strongly suggests that the related musculature and larynx position were likely also quite similar to ours.
So the hyoid bone contradicts the initial skull base interpretation.
It adds significant weight to the argument that Neanderthals were capable of producing a wide range of speech sounds. Furthermore, studies looking at the predicted hearing abilities of Neanderthals based on the structure of their ear bones.
They can figure that out too.
They can model it, yes. And those studies suggest Neanderthal hearing was optimized for the frequency range of modern human speech, just like ours is, and different from chimpanzees.
Wow, so multiple lines of evidence pointing towards Neanderthal speech capability.
Increasingly so, yes. The general picture now is that the evolution of the vocal tract was likely gradual. Perhaps Homo erectus had an intermediate anatomy, and then Homo heidelbergensis, Neanderthals, and early Homo sapiens all possessed increasingly modern or fully modern vocal tract configurations capable of producing complex speech sounds.
And it's not necessarily a single perfect shape either.
That's another recent insight. Research shows quite a bit of variation in vocal tract proportions, even among modern humans who are perfectly capable speakers. So maybe a precise ideal configuration isn't as critical as we once thought.
Okay, so the vocal anatomy seems to have evolved significantly.
Hmm.
What about the control center, the brain? We know brain size generally increased, but what specific changes inside the brain were key for language? It's not just about having a bigger engine, but how it's wired, right?
Precisely. Overall, brain size increase is obviously important, more processing power potentially. But specific reorganizational changes within the brain are considered critical for language.
Like which areas?
Two cortical regions traditionally get the most attention, Broca's area and Wernicke's area.
We mentioned Broca's earlier with Homo habilis. What's its main job?
Broca's area, typically located in the left frontal lobe, is most strongly linked to speech production. Things like grammatical processing, putting sentences together, and the motor control of articulation, the physical act of moving your lips, tongue, jaw to form words.
The output center. Can we see its evolution in fossils?
We can look at endocasts, those molds of the inside of the skull. They can sometimes preserve impressions of the brain's surface convolutions. There's some debated evidence, as we said, for enlargement, or maybe a more human-like pattern in the region, corresponding to Broca's area as early as Homo habilis, and perhaps more clearly in later Homo species, including Neanderthals.
And there's a link to hand movements, too.
Yes, interestingly, the primate equivalent of Broca's area is involved in orofacial movements and also seems connected to the mirror neuron system.
Mirror neurons, the ones involved in imitating actions.
Exactly. They fire both when an individual performs an action and when they observe the same action performed by someone else. This potential link between the brain area for manual action imitation and the area later crucial for speech production is one reason the gesture-first hypothesis remains compelling. It suggests a deep evolutionary connection.
And it's usually on the left side.
Yes, in most people, language functions are lateralized, primarily processed in the left hemisphere, and Broca's area often shows a slight anatomical asymmetry, being larger on the left. This lateralization might be an ancient feature. Think of Broca's area as the brain's speech construction zone.
Okay, what about Wernicke's area?
Wernicke's area, typically found further back in the left temporal lobe, is primarily associated with language comprehension, understanding the meaning of spoken or written words.
The input or understanding center. Is it harder to see its evolution?
It is generally considered more challenging to identify clear evolutionary changes in Wernicke's area just from endocasts, as the surface markings on the skull in that region are often less distinct. However, researchers are using sophisticated 3D imaging and comparative studies, looking at the patterns of folds and grooves, sulci and gyri, in humans, apes, and fossil endocasts, to try and map out how this region might have evolved.
D hints?
Some recent analyses suggest potential differences in the organization of this parietal temporal region between humans and chimpanzees, perhaps with some early Homo relatives showing intermediate or more human-like features. But it's an active area of research.
So it's not just about these two famous areas, right? They must be connected.
Absolutely critical. Language isn't localized to just one or two spots. It relies on complex, distributed neural networks connecting many different brain regions. You need pathways linking auditory processing areas for hearing speech, with motor areas for producing speech, and with conceptual areas for understanding meaning.
Can you give an example of these pathways?
Two major pathways are often discussed. There's a dorsal stream running upwards towards the parietal and premotor cortex. You can think of this as the how-to pathway, involved in mapping sound onto articulation, important for vocal imitation and learning speech sounds. And then there's a ventral stream running forward towards the anterior temporal lobe and lower frontal cortex. This is more of the what pathway, involved in mapping sound onto meaning, crucial for comprehension.
So both pathways needed strengthening.
It's hypothesized that the evolution of language involves significant strengthening and refinement of these pathways, particularly perhaps enhanced connections between auditory cortex and motor cortex via the dorsal stream, allowing for the complex vocal learning that underpins human speech. We also likely needed enhanced cortical control over the larynx and breathing muscles, which are controlled by older brainstem structures in most mammals. And just overall increased connectivity across the entire brain probably played a major role in supporting the complex computations required for language.
So it wasn't just bigger brain hardware, but also upgrading the software, the specific regions, the wiring, the control systems, all getting optimized for language.
That's a great way to think about it, a complex interplay of size, specialization, and connectivity.
Now let's move down to the code itself, our genes. What genetic factors are linked to the development of language? Is there really a single language gene?
Ah, the language gene idea. It's mostly associated with the FOXP2 gene.
Right, we mentioned it with Neanderthals. Tell us more about it.
FOXP2 was the first gene directly linked to a specific human speech and language disorder, a condition called developmental verbal dyspraxia, where affected individuals have severe difficulties with producing the coordinated sequences of muscle movements needed for speech.
So it's involved in the motor control aspect.
Primarily, yes, but maybe more broadly in certain types of learning too. It codes for a transcription factor.
Meaning it controls other genes.
Exactly, like a master switch. It regulates the activity of a whole network of downstream genes. And FOXT2 itself is highly conserved, meaning the gene is very similar across many different vertebrate species. It plays roles in brain development and vocal learning or communication in everything from songbirds learning their songs to mice making ultrasonic vocalizations to us.
So it's an old gene with a fundamental role. What's special about the human version?
The human FOXP2 protein differs from the chimpanzee version by just 2 amino acids, 2 small changes in a large protein. Initially, when these differences were discovered, it was thought they were very recent in human evolution, maybe arising only within the last 200,000 years, and had been under strong positive selection, meaning they provided a significant advantage.
Which would time it nicely with the emergence of modern Homo sapiens and maybe complex language.
That was the exciting initial hypothesis, but then came the surprise twist.
Finding it in Neanderthals and Denisovans?
Precisely. Sequencing ancient DNA from Neanderthal and Denisovan fossils revealed that they shared the exact same 2 amino acid substitutions as modern humans.
So those changes must be much older.
Much older. They must have occurred in the common ancestor of modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. That pushes the origin of these specific changes back to likely Homo heidelbergensis, maybe 500,000 years ago or even more.
Okay, so what do these human-specific or human Neanderthal Denisovan-specific changes actually do?
Well, experiments with mice that were genetically engineered to carry the humanized version of the FOXP2 gene showed some interesting results. They didn't start talking, obviously,
Right.
but they did show subtle but significant changes in their ultrasonic vocalizations, and importantly, they showed changes in specific brain circuits, particularly in the basal ganglia, and improved ability to learn certain types of procedural motor skills, learning sequences of actions until they become automatic.
Which could be relevant for learning the complex motor sequences of speech.
Exactly. It suggests the human variant might influence the efficiency or plasticity of brain circuits involved in motor learning and proceduralization, which could be highly relevant for acquiring speech sounds and maybe even aspects of grammar.
But it's not the language gene.
Definitely not. Language is far too complex to be pinned on a single gene. FOXP2 is clearly important, maybe a crucial facilitator, but it's just one piece of a much larger genetic puzzle. It's part of a complex network of genes that influence brain development, neuronal function, connectivity, and ultimately our capacity for speech and language. Think of it as one key instrument in a large orchestra, not the conductor or the entire symphony.
A key instrument, okay.
Yeah.
Are scientists looking for other instruments in that orchestra?
Absolutely. Research is ongoing to identify other candidate genes that may be involved in language evolution or related cognitive abilities. Genes involved in brain growth, like ASPM and MCPH1, neuronal migration, synaptic function. Some studies have looked at differences in these genes between humans and Neanderthals denisovans. One gene called CNTP, which is regulated by FOXP2, has also been implicated in language disorders.
Any recent exciting finds?
There was interesting work on a gene called NOVA1. It seems a specific variant in this gene is present in Homo sapiens, but was different in Neanderthals and Denisovans. When this human-specific variant was introduced into mice, it seemed to influence brain development and led to alterations in their vocalizations, making them somewhat more complex.
So maybe more recent genetic tweaks happened after the split from Neanderthals that further refined our abilities.
It's certainly possible. It suggests that the genetic basis of language likely involves many genes evolving at different times, contributing to different aspects of the overall capacity. It's a polygenic trait built up over a long evolutionary period.
Okay, it's like we're slowly piecing together the genetic recipe, finding more ingredients over time. Now, beyond the anatomy and the genes, what about the underlying ways of thinking? What cognitive foundations were necessary for language to emerge? It's not just about having the physical tools and the wiring, but the mental software too, right?
Absolutely. Several key cognitive abilities seem crucial. One fundamental prerequisite is symbolic capacity.
Symbolic capacity,
Hmm.
meaning,
The ability to use symbols, arbitrary forms like sounds, gestures, or written marks to represent concepts, objects, actions, or ideas, even when those things aren't physically present.
like the word water standing for the actual substance.
Exactly. The sound sequence water has no inherent connection to H2O. It's an arbitrary symbol that we've all agreed represents that concept. This ability to mentally manipulate symbols and think about things that aren't right in front of us, sometimes called displacement, is a cornerstone of language.
And where do we see evidence for this in the past?
Clear archaeological evidence for symbolic thought, things like personal ornaments, beads, pendants, the use of pigments like ochre, presumably for body decoration or rituals, intentional burials with grave goods, abstract engravings on bone or ochre, and eventually figurative art becomes much more common and unambiguous in later hominins, particularly Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens.
So maybe starting around 100,000 years ago or so.
Yeah. The evidence gets much stronger around then, yes, especially in Africa with Homo sapiens. Though there are hints of earlier symbolic behaviors, like potential pigment use even further back, and as we discussed, the debate about symbolism in Acheulean tools, but widespread, undeniable symbolic culture really seems to take off with later hominins.
Okay, so symbolic thought is key. What else?
The capacity for sophisticated imitation and social learning is vital. Language isn't innate in its specific form, like English or Swahili. It has to be learned from others in your community.
Right. Babies have to learn to talk.
Exactly. And this learning relies on more than just simple mimicry. It requires what's sometimes called high-fidelity imitation, the ability to accurately copy not just the actions, but also understand the underlying goals and intentions of the person you're learning from.
Understanding why they're doing something, not just what they're doing.
Precisely. This ability to understand intentions is crucial for learning shared communicative conventions, agreeing on what symbols mean and how to use them. The mirror neuron system we mentioned earlier might play a role here, helping us map others' actions onto our own motor system. It's like being able to not just copy a dance move, but to understand how it fits the music and the overall dance.
Makes sense. And you need a good memory too, right? To hold sentences in your head.
Definitely. Working memory is crucial. That's your mental workspace, the ability to hold and manipulate information in your mind over short periods.
Like remembering the beginning of a sentence while someone is still talking.
Exactly that. Language processing puts heavy demands on working memory. You need to hold sequences of sounds, access word meanings, figure out grammatical relationships, all in real time. One component, often called the phonological loop, seems specialized for temporarily storing verbal information.
Did our working memory capacity evolve?
It almost certainly did. The evolution of increased working memory capacity likely went hand in hand with the development of language. Some researchers even suggest that the cognitive demands of complex tool-making keeping sequences of actions in mind might have helped drive the expansion of working memory, which then provided a foundation that language could build upon. You likely need pretty advanced working memory to handle the complex, nested sentence structures we see in modern Homo sapiens.
Okay, symbol use, imitation, working memory.
Oh,
Anything else?
one more really important one, theory of mind.
Theory of mind. That sounds philosophical.
It's a cognitive term for the ability to attribute mental states, beliefs, desires, intentions, knowledge to oneself and to others. Basically, understanding that other people have minds of their own with thoughts and feelings that might be different from yours.
Why is that so important for communication?
It's crucial for effective communication, especially for understanding pragmatics, the meaning that goes beyond the literal words. To understand sarcasm, implication, politeness, or even just to have a normal conversation, you need to constantly make inferences about what your communication partner knows, what they intend to convey, and how they might interpret what you say.
Like figuring out what someone really means when they say something.
Exactly. There seems to be a close link, maybe even a co-evolutionary relationship between the development of language, particularly complex grammar, like embedded clauses, and the development of theory of mind abilities. Children's ability in one often tracks their ability in the other. If you can model what someone else is thinking, you can tailor your communication much more effectively to get your message across and understand theirs.
Wow. So it sounds like a whole suite of interconnected cognitive upgrades, thinking in symbols, learning from others effectively, holding information in mind, and understanding others' minds, all had to develop alongside, or perhaps as prerequisites for, full-blown language.
That's the picture, yes. It wasn't just one thing, but a complex coevolution of biological hardware and cognitive software.
Okay, so we've looked at the hominin players, the pre-language communication, the biological changes, the cognitive foundations. Now let's delve into some of the big picture hypotheses about how language actually emerged and evolved. We've talked about the building blocks, but what are the different ideas about the overall process, the timeline, the pattern, the driving forces?
Right, moving to the grand theories. One major debate centers on the pace and pattern. Did language evolve gradually over a very long period, or was it a more sudden, perhaps recent event?
Gradual versus sudden. What's the case for gradualism?
Gradualist perspectives argue for a slow, incremental, step-by-step development. Starting from simple signals in early hominins, communication systems slowly became more complex over potentially millions of years. This fits well with standard Darwinian evolutionary thinking. Evolution usually proceeds through small, cumulative changes. Proponents point to the vast timescale of hominin evolution, the existence of intermediate species with intermediate brain sizes and likely capabilities, and the sheer complexity of language itself, suggesting it needed a long time to develop.
Makes intuitive sense. What about the sudden emergence idea, the saltationist view?
Saltationist perspectives propose a more abrupt, relatively recent emergence of language, often linked specifically to Homo sapiens, maybe within the last 100,000 or 200,000 years. This is sometimes tied to the idea of a key genetic mutation or a sudden cognitive breakthrough that enabled a crucial component of language, like recursion.
Recursion, what's that again?
Recursion is basically the ability to embed structures within structures of the same type. In language, it's what allows us to create sentences like, "The dog that chased the cat that ate the mouse barked." You can nest clauses within clauses, theoretically indefinitely. Some linguists, notably Noam and Chomsky, have argued that recursion is the core, unique feature of human language, and perhaps emerged relatively suddenly.
What evidence supports this sudden view?
Opponents sometimes highlight the apparent vast gap between human language and any form of animal communication, suggesting something truly novel must have happened. They might also point to the archaeological record, where complex symbolic behavior seems to appear relatively abruptly, particularly with the so-called Upper Paleolithic Revolution in Europe, though that concept is now debated and complex behavior is known much earlier in Africa.
So a long, slow ramp versus a sudden switch being flipped.
That's the traditional dichotomy, but reality is likely more nuanced. Many researchers now favor a view that combines elements of both. Perhaps there was a long period of gradual accumulation of the necessary prerequisites, the cognitive abilities, the anatomical changes, the social structures, followed by a more rapid integration, or the emergence of a final key component, maybe something like recursion or advanced syntax, relatively late in the process, perhaps specifically in Homo sapiens.
So a long simmer followed by a quicker boil.
That's a good way to put it. The increasing evidence for Neanderthal cognitive and potentially linguistic sophistication, and the dating of language-related genes and anatomical features back to Homo heidelbergensis or earlier, definitely challenges a strictly recent, sapiens-only saltationist view. The foundations seem much older.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the other big debate, the initial modality? Did language start primarily with gestures or vocalizations or both?
Right, the modality debate. We touched on this earlier. The gesture-first hypothesis, championed by researchers like Michael Corballis and others, emphasizes the pre-existing flexibility and voluntary control of primate gestures, the idea that bipedalism freed the hands, and suggests that gestures provided the initial scaffolding for symbolic communication. Maybe sign language came first, essentially.
The charades idea again.
Exactly. Then there are vocal-first hypotheses. These propose that language evolved more directly from primate vocal calls, with gradual increases in voluntary control over vocalizations, the repertoire of sounds, and their combination. Proponents might point to the efficiency of speech it works in the dark, over distances, frees the hands.
But we said primate vocalizations were pretty limited, right?
That's a key challenge for strict vocal-first models. How did hominins overcome the seeming constraints on primate vocal flexibility and learning?
Which leads back to
Multimodal hypotheses, which, as we discussed, are gaining a lot of traction. These suggest that language likely emerged through the integration of vocalizations, gestures, facial expressions, body posture, right from the start, or at least from very early on, much like how we communicate today.
so using all the channels available.
Precisely. the relative importance of each modality might have shifted over time. Maybe gesture was crucial for establishing the initial symbolic links, but as vocal control improved, perhaps linked to FOXP2 evolution, vocal tract changes, the vocal channel became increasingly dominant for conveying complex information, while gesture remained important for emphasis, emotion, and spatial information.
That seems like a plausible integrated picture. Now let's talk about the why. What were the main driving forces, the selective pressures that pushed this incredible evolution of communication forward? Why did our ancestors need to develop something as complex as language? What were the evolutionary benefits?
That's a huge question and likely involves multiple interacting factors. Several key selective pressures are commonly proposed. One major driver is thought to be the demands of increasing cooperation and social complexity. As hominin groups became larger or engaged in more complex cooperative activities like coordinated hunting, group defense, food sharing, raising offspring collectively, the need for better communication to coordinate actions, manage social relationships, build alliances, resolve conflicts, and maintain group cohesion would have become immense.
So living together effectively required talking together effectively.
Essentially, yes. Think about managing reputations, tracking who owes what to whom, indirect reciprocity, negotiating status, maintaining pair bonds or larger alliances. Language is an incredibly powerful tool for navigating complex social landscapes. Some even link it to social grooming language as a more efficient way to build and maintain social bonds in large groups compared to the time-consuming physical grooming seen in other primates.
Interesting. What else?
Another major proposed driver is the need for effective teaching and information transfer, what we call cultural transmission. As hominins developed increasingly complex technologies like sophisticated tool-making or fire control, or accumulated knowledge about resources, predators, or social norms, the ability to accurately transmit this knowledge from one individual to another, and especially across generations, would have been highly advantageous.
So language is the ultimate teaching tool.
Exactly. Explicit instruction, sharing abstract knowledge, planning for the future. Language makes cultural accumulation possible on a scale unthinkable without it. There's even a technological pedagogy hypothesis suggesting that the demands of teaching complex tool-making skills might have been a key driver for early language evolution.
Okay, cooperation in teaching.
Yeah.
Any other big ideas?
Sexual selection is another one often brought up.
Language as attractive.
Potentially, yes. The idea, proposed by researchers like Jeffrey Miller, is that linguistic abilities, having a large vocabulary, being witty, telling good stories, arguing persuasively, could have served as honest signals of underlying cognitive fitness, intelligence, creativity, and maybe even good genes.
So being a smooth talker helped you find a mate.
That's the idea. It could help explain why language seems more complex and elaborate than strictly necessary for basic survival tasks. Verbal artistry, humor, complex narratives, maybe these evolved partly because they were attractive to potential partners.
Fascinating. It has a whole different dimension.
And finally, there's the idea of language shaping thought itself, cognitive niche construction. The idea here is that language didn't just evolve to fit pre-existing cognitive abilities, but that language itself fundamentally reshaped the human mind.
How so?
By providing labels for concepts, enabling abstract thought, facilitating mental time travel, thinking about past and future, supporting complex reasoning and planning, even enabling metacognition, thinking about thinking. In this view, language actively created the cognitive niche that humans now occupy, and language itself became a selective pressure, driving further cognitive evolution in a coevolutionary loop.
Wow. So language didn't just let us express thoughts, it actually changed how we think.
That's the argument. It's likely that all of these factors, social complexity, cooperation, teaching, maybe sexual selection, and cognitive coevolution, interacted in a complex feedback loop over a long period to drive the evolution of language. It probably wasn't just one single magic bullet reason, but a whole web of interconnected pressures and benefits that favored increasingly sophisticated communication.
A complex problem needing complex solutions, driving complex communication. Okay, now let's tackle a really fundamental question that fascinates a lot of people. Was there ever a single first language? The whole idea of a proto-world language that all modern languages descend from, where does science stand on that today?
Right, the proto-world hypothesis. It's the idea that all modern human languages, despite their incredible diversity, ultimately trace back to a single ancestral language, presumably spoken by an early Homo sapiens population somewhere in Africa before humans dispersed across the globe.
This fits with the out-of-Africa model of human origins, doesn't it?
It aligns very well with the standard recent African origin model, yes. The thinking is that this ancestral population had language, and as groups migrated out of Africa and spread around the world, their languages diverged and changed over time, eventually leading to the thousands of distinct languages and language families we see today.
Is there any linguistic evidence for this single origin, like features all languages share?
People sometimes point to linguistic universals, those structural features or properties that seem to be found in most or all human languages, as potential hints of a shared ancestry. Things like having nouns and verbs or ways to ask questions. However, these universals could also reflect universal cognitive constraints or functional requirements for any communication system, rather than necessarily proving a single historical origin.
So universals don't seal the deal. Is there an alternative hypothesis?
Yes, the main alternative is polygenesis. The idea that language didn't arise just once, but emerged independently in multiple different early human populations around the world.
Language evolving multiple times. Is that plausible?
Arguments for polygenesis sometimes point to the sheer improbability of such a complex system evolving only once. They might also note that other complex cultural traits, like agriculture or writing, seem to have been invented independently in different places. The existence of numerous language families around the world that show no demonstrable relationship to each other could also be seen as consistent with multiple origins, although this could also just be due to the limits of our ability to detect relationships over vast time depths.
What about sign languages? Don't they sometimes arise spontaneously?
That's another point often raised in favor of polygenesis, or at least the potential for language to emerge independently. When deaf children are brought together without a pre-existing sign language, they often spontaneously develop their own new sign language, complete with grammatical structure, within a generation or two. This demonstrates the strong, innate human capacity and drive to create language when the social conditions are right.
So we have monogenesis, single origin, versus polygenesis, multiple origins. Can we figure out which is right? Can we actually reconstruct this potential first language, proto-world?
This is where linguistics runs into some hard limits. The scientific consensus among historical linguists is that reconstructing proto-world using the standard methods of their field is currently and probably permanently not feasible.
Why not? We can reconstruct other proto-languages, right? Like Proto-Indo-European.
Yes, the comparative method is the main tool historical linguists use. It involves comparing related languages, identifying systematic sound correspondences in basic vocabulary, words called cognates, and using those correspondences to reconstruct the likely sound system and vocabulary of their common ancestor, the proto-language.
How far back can that method reliably reach?
It works reasonably well for time depths of maybe 6,000 to 8,000 years, perhaps up to 10,000 years in some cases where the evidence is good, like for Proto-Indo-European or Proto-Afroasiatic. But beyond that, things get very difficult.
And proto-world would be much, much older.
Orders of magnitude older. If language arose with early Homo sapiens, we're talking maybe 100,000, 150,000 years ago, or even earlier. Over such vast stretches of time, languages change, so much sounds shift, words get replaced entirely, meanings drift, that the faint signals of shared ancestry are almost completely eroded.
Too much noise obscures the signal.
Exactly. Regular sound change and vocabulary replacement make it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to reliably distinguish genuine ancient relationships, true cognates, from mere chance similarities between words, or from very ancient borrowing between unrelated languages. The signal essentially disappears into the noise of random resemblance.
What about other methods? Haven't some people tried comparing basic words across lots of language families?
Yes, there have been attempts using methods like mass comparison or multilateral comparison associated with linguists like Joseph Greenberg and Merritt Rulin. This involves looking for widespread similarities in basic vocabulary, like words for I, you, water, hand, across many different language families simultaneously, hoping to find patterns that might reflect a deeper common origin.
And what do mainstream linguists think of that approach?
It's largely rejected by the majority of historical linguists. The main criticisms are that these methods often suffer from errors in the data, lack rigorous criteria for determining similarity, relying too much on subjective judgments, fail to adequately exclude the high probability of chance resemblances when comparing so many languages, and don't effectively account for ancient borrowing. The proposed global etymologies are generally considered highly speculative and unreliable.
So while the idea of a single proto-world is biologically plausible, given our likely single origin in Africa.
Right, the genetic and paleoanthropological evidence strongly supports a recent African origin for Homo sapiens, which makes a single origin for the capacity for language and perhaps for language itself biologically the most parsimonious scenario. All humans share this fundamental capacity.
But the linguistic evidence to actually reconstruct that specific ancestral language, or even definitively prove it existed based solely on comparing modern languages, just isn't there. The time depth is too great.
That's the current scientific consensus. The linguistic details of that potential first language, if it existed, are likely lost to us forever, washed away by the tides of time and linguistic change.
It's a humbling reminder of the limits of our tools when dealing with the sheer vastness of evolutionary time. Now, thinking about time, let's explicitly connect these deep evolutionary timescales we've been discussing with a much shorter timescale of written history. Written records only go back about 5,000 or 6,000 years, right?
That's correct. The invention of writing systems, Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs being among the earliest, is a relatively recent development in the grand scheme of human evolution and even the history of language itself.
So there's a huge gap between the origins of language, maybe hundreds of thousands of years ago, and the start of written records.
A massive gap. This means that historical records, while incredibly valuable for studying human history and how languages have changed in more recent millennia, cannot provide us with any direct evidence about the ultimate origins of language itself, or how early hominins like Homo erectus or even early Homo sapiens communicated before writing. Writing simply emerges long after spoken language was already fully established and highly complex in Homo sapiens.
So those ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian clay tablets aren't going to whisper any secrets about what Homo erectus was talking about around the campfire?
Not directly, no. The communication systems of those earlier hominins are completely unattested, vanished without a trace other than the indirect clues we've been discussing from bones, stones, and genes.
But can historical linguistics and written records offer any indirect insights into language origins?
Yes, they can be relevant indirectly. By studying language change as it's documented in written records over the last few thousand years, historical linguists can observe and understand the actual processes by which languages change. They see how sounds shift systematically, how grammar evolves, a process called grammaticalization, where words become grammatical markers, how languages borrow words and structures from each other, how new languages can arise through divergence, like Latin evolving into French, Spanish, Italian, or through contact, like Creole languages forming.
And we can see the mechanisms of change in action.
Exactly. We can observe these processes happening in real time or reconstruct them over documented history. Linguists can then use these observed processes to develop models and hypotheses about the kinds of changes and evolutionary pathways that might have occurred in the much deeper, unrecorded past during the initial emergence and early evolution of language. We can cautiously extrapolate by analogy.
But with some big caveats, presumably.
Absolutely. We have to be extremely cautious when extrapolating from historical language change back to the ultimate origins. Early hominins, especially before Homo sapiens, had different cognitive capacities, different brain structures, lived in vastly different social structures, and faced different environmental pressures than humans in recorded history. The processes involved in the initial emergence of language from a simpler, perhaps non-linguistic or proto-linguistic system might have been qualitatively different from the kinds of changes we see happening within already established, complex human languages.
So historical records give us some clues about the how of language change once language exists. But we need to be careful assuming those same rules applied to the very first sparks of language, getting it off the ground in the first place.
Precisely. The initial bootstrapping process might have involved different mechanisms or constraints.
Okay, let's bring things right up to the present now. What have been some of the most recent exciting developments and current frontiers of research in the field of language evolution, say, in the last 10 to 15 years or so, roughly 2010, 2025? Where is the cutting edge?
It's been a really dynamic period. I think one of the biggest trends has been an even deeper integration and collaboration across those different disciplines we mentioned at the start. We're seeing much more synergy between genetics, especially ancient DNA analysis and comparative genomics, neuroscience, using advanced brain imaging on humans and comparative neuroanatomy across species, archaeology with new finds, better dating, and more focus on cognitive interpretations and experimental archaeology, computational modeling, testing theories virtually, and linguistics and primatology working closely together.
breaking down the silos between fields.
Exactly. And this cross-pollination is leading to some major advances and shifts in thinking.
Like what specifically? What are some key findings or refined understandings from this recent period?
Well, in genetics, our understanding of FOXP2 has become much more nuanced. We know the key human variants are ancient, shared with Neanderthals, suggesting their role is foundational rather than specific to modern language emergence. Research now focuses on its role within broader gene networks and its potential influence beyond just motor control, perhaps in procedural learning. And as we mentioned, the identification of other candidate genes potentially involved, like NOVIAT1, and the growing appreciation that language capacity is highly polygenic, involving many genes of small effect, is crucial.
In paleoanthropology and archaeology.
We've seen significant developments there, too. The pushing back of the date for the earliest Homo sapiens fossils to around 300,000 years ago in Morocco, continued discoveries confirming complex behaviors associated with the Middle Stone Age in Africa, appearing possibly 100,000 years ago, or even earlier things like sophisticated tools, long-distance transport of materials, use of pigments and ornaments, and very importantly, the growing body of evidence for Neanderthal cognitive sophistication, symbolic behavior, burials, ornaments, maybe even cave markings, and as we discussed, their likely capacity for speech.
That Neanderthal reassessment seems like a really big shift.
It really is. It fundamentally changes the narrative away from a simple us versus them or a sudden and sapient-specific revolution. It suggests deep roots for complex cognition and communication.
How about theoretical shifts? Are the big questions changing?
Yes, there's definitely been a shift in theoretical focus. There's much more emphasis now on the role of cultural evolution and social learning in shaping language, viewing language not just as a biological instinct, but as a culturally transmitted system that evolves over generations, shaping and being shaped by the human brain and society, the idea of language as part of human niche construction.
So more focus on learning and transmission.
Exactly. And linked to that, a greater emphasis on the importance of cooperation, pro-sociality, positive social behavior, and teaching in driving language evolution. The multimodality of language, the interplay of speech, gesture, facial expression is also getting more attention, as is the potential role of iconicity, where the form of a signal resembles its meaning, like in pantomime or some sign language, in the early stages of language development. And related concepts like the human self-domestication hypothesis are being explored for their potential links to the evolution of enhanced social tolerance and communication skills needed for language.
Self-domestication, like we domesticated ourselves.
Kind of, yeah. The idea is that humans might have undergone a process similar to the domestication of animals, involving selection against aggression and towards increased cooperation and social tolerance, which could have facilitated the emergence of complex communication and culture. It's still debated, but it's an intriguing idea connecting social evolution with language.
Okay. So putting it all together, can we constrain the timing of language origins any better now?
We're getting better estimates. Genomic studies comparing diverse modern human populations suggest that the core biological capacity for language was likely present in Homo sapiens by at least, say, 135,000 years ago, possibly earlier, based on population divergence times. And the Neanderthal evidence pushes the foundations for advanced communication, maybe even speech similar to early sapiens, back much further, predating the Neanderthal-sapiens split, potentially emerging with Homo heidelbergensis.
So the core abilities are likely quite ancient, maybe 500,000 years old or more.
The foundational elements, quite possibly, yes. The full suite of modern human language capabilities might be more recent, perhaps solidifying within Homo sapiens over the last 200,000 years, but the idea of language appearing suddenly out of nowhere just 50,000 years ago is looking increasingly unlikely.
It sounds like the field is becoming more rigorous, too.
Yes, definitely. We're seeing more sophisticated methodologies, more empirical data being brought to bear, and research on language evolution being published in high-impact general science journals, reflecting its growing scientific maturity. The focus is shifting towards understanding the specific mechanisms of change, the interplay between biological and cultural evolution, the evolution of specific linguistic features like syntax or recursion, and the relative importance of different selective pressures.
A lot of progress, but still lots to figure out.
Always.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's try to synthesize. Based on everything we've discussed, what are the main areas where there's now a broad scientific agreement or consensus about the origins and evolution of language?
Okay, areas of broad consensus. I'd say there's general agreement that language, in its full human form, is unique to our species, but has deep evolutionary roots stretching back into our primate ancestry. There's evolutionary continuity, not a complete break.
Okay.
There's strong consensus that language relies on specific biological foundations, adaptations in the brain, specialized areas, connectivity, the vocal tract, and our genome, like FOXP2 and other
Of
genes.
biological machinery.
Right. There's also broad agreement that social factors, cooperation, group living, cultural transmission, and cognitive factors, symbolic thought, theory of mind, working memory, were crucial drivers and prerequisites for its evolution.
But wasn't just biology.
Definitely not.
Mhm.
And there's strong consensus based on genetics and the fossil record that the capacity for modern language ultimately originated in Africa within ancient Homo sapiens populations, even if some foundational elements were present earlier in ancestral species like Homo heidelbergensis or shared with close relatives like Neanderthals. The antiquity of this capacity is also increasingly accepted, certainly present well over 100,000 years ago.
And the need for teamwork between sciences.
Absolutely. Universal agreement that understanding language evolution requires an interdisciplinary approach, integrating insights from all those fields we listed at the beginning. No single field holds all the answers.
Okay, so those are the areas of general agreement. What about the flip side? What are the key ongoing debates, the major controversies, the things scientists are still arguing about?
Plenty of those still. One major area is the precise timing and tempo of language evolution. Was it mostly gradual, or were there periods of more rapid change? Exactly when did different key components, like complex syntax, emerge?
Still fuzzy on the exact timeline.
Yes. Relatedly, the debate about the initial modality continues. Was it primarily gesture-based early on, vocal-based, or always multimodal? The relative importance might have shifted, but the starting point is still discussed.
Gesture versus vocal versus both.
Then there's the question of the full linguistic and cognitive capabilities of archaic hominins, especially Neanderthals. While the consensus is shifting towards greater capability, the precise nature and complexity of their language compared to early Homo sapiens is still debated.
How close were they to us linguistically?
That's the question. Also, the exact nature of proto-language. What was it actually like? Did it have words but no grammar? Simple grammar? What were its characteristics? That remains speculative.
Hard to know what the intermediate steps look like.
Very hard. The relative importance of the different selective pressures we discussed, cooperation versus teaching versus sexual selection versus cognitive niche construction, is also actively debated. Which factors were the primary drivers at different stages?
The why is still being debated.
And finally, while linguistic reconstruction can't reach proto-world, the conceptual question of monogenesis versus polygenesis, whether the capacity for language arose just once in Africa or potentially multiple times, independently remains a background debate, even if difficult to resolve empirically.
So still plenty of juicy questions for scientists to tackle.
Absolutely, and that's what makes the field so exciting. We need continued progress on multiple fronts. New fossil discoveries, especially those that preserve relevant anatomy like hyoid bones or inner ear structures, continued advancements in ancient DNA extraction and analysis, more sophisticated neuroimaging techniques to compare brain structure and function across species, more powerful computational models to simulate evolutionary processes, and ongoing theoretical refinement, integrating all these lines of evidence.
It sounds like the picture is one of emergence from complexity.
That's a great way to put it. Language evolution is increasingly seen as an emergent property of a complex adaptive system involving the coevolution of genes, brains, behavior, and culture over vast periods. Many questions remain, but the interdisciplinary efforts are steadily illuminating this fundamental aspect of human uniqueness.
This has been a truly fascinating deep dive into the origins of language. It's just amazing to see how all these different threads, bones, genes, tools, behavior, brains, culture, have to be woven together to even begin to tackle this incredibly complex question.
It really is one of the ultimate scientific detective stories.
And as you've shown us, while we've made incredible progress, especially recently, there are still so many exciting mysteries left to unravel. This story is definitely still unfolding.
Absolutely. Each new discovery, each new analysis adds another piece to the puzzle and sometimes rearranges the pieces we thought we understood. It keeps us humble and curious.
So a final thought for you, our listener, to ponder after journeying with us through millions of years of hominin evolution. Considering all the evidence and the different perspectives we've discussed today, the biological changes, the cognitive leaps, the social pressures, what do you think might have been the most critical factor, the real tipping point in the development of language as we know it? Was it getting the vocal tract just right? Was it the evolution of symbolic thought? Was it the need to cooperate in larger groups? Or was it something else entirely, maybe an interplay we haven't fully grasped yet? mull that over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.